So today, from the managing services perspective, we will be discussing this topic about managing partner relationships. We have already discussed in depth aspects regarding customer relationship and the high importance of relationship building in all service businesses. But today, side by side with managing partner relationships, which is as important in service business as is customer relationship management, because as you will see from today's discussion that in many cases there is partnership and customership overlap and diffuse into each other. So from the contemporary issues perspective, what we want to discuss today is the emerging ecosystems of services around the world. So today, first, we can look at this traditional supply chain where we have a service provider and a customer. So far, we have been discussing, when we earlier discussed about relationship management, we discussed about this P2C relationship management, and I just added a bidirectional arrow because it is an interactive relationship. But what is happening today due to information and communication technology, this relationship, which was earlier in the background, is now part of the overall very explicit range of relationships. So in a way, instead of this kind of linear linkages, we are looking more and more at this kind of networks. I had already discussed previously the importance of networks and how the networks are changing all businesses, and more so in case of service businesses. If you look at this, this is a systemic diagram, and we will see its instances or with examples soon. So fundamentally what is now happening is that you will see even in this, we have put P, the service provider, in the center, which means as if this is actually the mediating node between this range of service suppliers, who are themselves again nodes of next level service suppliers, and as if this is the central node which connects to customers and all the other types of customers. I mean, like for example, you can think this a hotel at a holiday destination, a major hotel at a holiday destination. So this will be that major hotel at the holiday destination. This will be the core service provider, or in a way the hub service provider. Now customers will link to this service provider. The customers themselves will be, they may go with a family, they may go in a group, it can be a business convention, it can be a cricket team visiting a destination. So therefore, the customer 1 or customer 2 or customer 3 themselves may also have, it actually represents a network. And then we have the hotel at the holiday destination. Now there will be suppliers. There will be suppliers who are related to the hotel service, like maybe food and vegetable suppliers. There will be suppliers who are related to providing auxiliary services or associated services, like say local tourism or transportation and so on. So as a result, what we see is like this. that hotels, airlines, restaurants, so this is actually we are moving away from that hub and spoke where we were looking at this destination hotel as the kind of a hub. But in the next diagram, we look at customers, and we have just understood that this itself is actually a network. And then there are hotels, airlines, restaurants, entertainment activities, transportation companies of a particular destination, say Goa. And then connecting this ecosystem of all kinds of service customers, connecting to all kinds of service customers in this particular destination. And then there are connectors like tour operators operating through travel agents. So that is one kind of connection. There are big tour operators with their number of branch offices at various places. That means instead of using a partner, they may do it through their own offices. That is another way this network connects to this network connects to this network. Or these days, through internet and telephone, there can be a direct connection from this network to this network. That means instead of this kind of a single channel, there can be, so this is a network. I am deliberately putting some non-linear parts here, and this is another network. So there are no explicit hubs and spokes here, and this network to this network, there can be number of connections. Some connections may go through one of the nodes, some connections may be. So it has become quite easy now for a customer. Earlier the logistics used to be quite complicated, so people preferred to go to a travel agent. Travel agent contacted local tour operators, and local tour operators sort of aggregated these services. Now the internet itself is a very efficient and very powerful aggregator. So lot of customers can connect to lot of suppliers, and there can be number of aggregator services which will be utilized. So this is what we mean by emergence of linear partner relationships, from linear partner relationships to emergence of service ecosystem. So this is what we are meaning by service ecosystem. There are other kinds of service ecosystems also now emerging. They had always existed, but in the background, but now they can become also quite explicit, and so the background foreground divisions are now often getting diffused. Take for example the services with respect to buying a new house. So there is seller and there is customer. Now earlier many of these services were often invisible to the customer, because there might have been in between an estate agent who basically connected the seller and the buyer, and the estate agent had other relationships to give a comprehensive service. Today the customer and the seller both know that there are other players in the ecosystem. There are loan providers, there are telecom service provider, or people who will help to do packing and forwarding or removals, water, electricity, post office. All of these are related for a customer, enabling a customer to move to a new house. And the ownership transfer will involve land registry or lawyer on both sides, lawyer and surveyor and so on. And many of these relationships, as you can see now, they are going crisscross. So they are going, the customer can directly connect to estate agent as they did before, but the customer can directly talk to the seller. Customer can, because many of these web based estate agents allow the customer and seller to talk to each other. The customer will talk to the loan provider, but the seller, if it is a housing development corporation, they may also talk directly to the loan provider to see that the customer gets the loan easily, the particular project, the housing project is certified by the loan provider. Many of these issues like the buyer's lawyer, the seller themselves may provide a composite service to number of customers to deal with the legal agency and the land registry in one stroke. So, this becomes an additional service provided by a housing development corporation acting as a seller along with estate agents. They provide this number of different services, which earlier were other discrete services. Now, this becomes a composite service provided by the seller development agency, and it is possible today to do it quite efficiently and effectively and at a reasonable cost because of the emergence of many different types of communication technologies and facilities. From this, therefore, we see the emergence of different types of networks acting as alliances, acting as ecosystems, and obviously to be part of the ecosystem between partner A, partner B, there has to be strategic fit, there has to be cultural fit. This in itself is a very, very interesting area, that how the service ecosystems, or I would say digital service ecosystems emerge, what are the properties, when a digital ecosystem is successful, what are the possibilities of failure one has to guard against, and all these are interesting subjects on which you can actually do some web search, and you will be able to read some quite a few interesting articles. Some of them are also written by me, so you can actually search for this digital business ecosystem or digital service ecosystem and see the importance of goals, importance of values, beliefs, controls and procedures. So, there are hard issues and there are soft issues, both are important to create, manage and propagate a service network. This is a sort of a more composite academic picture of global outsourcing and networking of partners or emergence of service ecosystem. So, I think we can call this whole diagram as service ecosystem, and we are adding a new word, global service ecosystem. I will discuss this in greater depth in the next lecture. Today I want to just point out before I conclude few interesting characteristics and examples. So, in the global network strategy, as you will see that people join these ecosystems with different types of motives. There can be market seeking motives, there can be resource seeking motives, there can be strategic asset or complementary asset seeking motives. So, which means that there can be a hotel and the hotel can have an alliance with some local tour operators or local boat operators or local excursion operators, because, and that is actually an alliance based on market seeking and resource seeking or mutual sharing of strategic asset. Sometimes due to core competence of one type of supplier, there can be also efficiency seeking. That means the whole service offering will be shared among the most efficient partners with respect to one particular section of that service. Within there will be some issues at the background like cultural influences, transfer of technology issues, organizational structure issues, and location, selection of partners, subcontractors, etc. Let's take some more, let's go deeper into this. So what we are saying is that there are service providers, and there are many service providers. They all form certain kind of an ecosystem with an ecosystem of customers. So there are customers, there are families, there are friends, it can be a business group. So there are customers and subsidiary customers, service providers and subsidiary service providers. In case of service subsidiary means the first diagram that we looked at, that means it is some kind of a hub and spoke relationship. But as we also discussed, that there can be a constellation of service providers on one side interacting with a constellation of customers on the other side. But all these relationships, even though this looks a pretty fuzzy sort of setting, service design and certain rules of the game are very important, otherwise the technical network will not operate properly. So service design is an important point. There are material transfer, there are information transfer, and we will see mostly, of course, these digital business ecosystems or digital service ecosystems are quite successful when the service is more of information transfer. Information, of course, can lead to, for example, information about seat availability can lead to finally a material attribute like a seat on a particular boat going to a particular island. But mostly the transactions are based on information transfer. This gives you number of different, these are two level or bidirectional service supply relationships or networks. Like for example, service category mind, customer, supplier, patient. So the patient is disturbed, there is some kind of mental agony. So there is a service provider, is a mental therapist, and as a result of which there can be prescription drugs leading to pharmacy. So there is a pharmacy is serving the patient, and the therapist is also serving the patient, and there is a network formation here. And so this is the patient, this is the pharmacy, and this is the therapist. And there is an interactivity. There could be like physician, patient, and pathology lab, similar type of network, small network formation. Or there can be a driver or an owner, and there is a garage, and there is a more detailed or more exhaustive, say, engine rebuilding, where there is a machine shop which serves this garage, which in turn serves as a driver. So this is another kind of network formation, linkage formation. So here is the garage, and there is the machine shop, and there is the owner or driver. Similarly, there can be a home buyer and the mortgage company, and there can be services like the title search. So again, you see there are different bidirectional linkage formations here. So this kind of looks at the contemporary shift compared to the situation as we had before. So earlier service recipients were passive. Because of this network formation and ecosystem formation, service recipient is quite active as a co-producer. This aspect we have discussed number of times during this course. Flow of service was earlier often waiting for demand. Now because of this intense digital activity among the players, this is also often available, activated upon demand. So the pipeline sort of inventory now is often not required, because real-time information about demand will be available to all the players. So it is not going through different stages as a result of which there is latency introduced in the network. Now there are all one-to-one connections. So all players are simultaneously informed if a passenger has decided to shift his or her arrival in Goa by a week. So everybody knows that that particular, so they are not waiting with a particular earlier booking status. They all know that now everything has to shift, and the customer also interacts and knows that some of the services therefore may not be available. They may look for alternative services and so on. So flow of information upstream, downstream is now more based on push-pull mechanism, and there is a real-time tracking and dispatching is now possible. Demand management is proactively done by the customer themselves, scheduling, just as the example that we were discussing just now about arrival in Goa, and the Goa system, as we saw in a previous presentation, is that whole hotels, restaurants, tour operators, different types of excursion facilities, these are all forming one ecosystem. And the customer in interaction therefore now proactively can talk about rescheduling or changes and so on. So as a result, there are many different approaches to capacity management which we discussed before. So the capacity constraint is often now managed because of this shift by cross training of people and different sorts of outsourcing relationships. This becomes much more easier to manage capacity or avoid loss or perishability of capacity. So these are some interesting things that are emerging in the service business because of technology availability. I will end one interesting diagram, that is how actually these ecosystems often develop over time. So this you can say, for example, Delhi and Gurgaon and Noida, Ghaziabad, they are now actually all part of a network themselves, connected through high speed different types of transport linkages. And the railway system, or more interestingly these metro linkages, which are making high speed transport quite easy and possible across these. So this is, say, Faridabad, this could be Gurgaon, this can be Delhi, and this Delhi Metro, as it is called, is now connecting all these places of the National Capital Region, known as NCR in short. And as you see here, because of this the emerging nature of lifeline-like connectivity, and this becomes the trunk of the network, touching almost all the points. So at the service nodes like the metro stations, we see emergence of different types of services. And as this the metro service matures, we will see that each metro station will then become an ecosystem of different types of services, be it convenience store or pharmaceutical store, restaurants, office buildings, malls, department stores, banks. They will all kind of grow as a cluster around this network nodes. And this has happened in most other cities around the world, and we will definitely see it happening in our country as well. So, and it makes it possible therefore to change the nature of the service. This is, I am moving to another way. This is actually the internet shop and the physical shop are now connected through, at the background, these different types of, so the customer can actually choose stuff on the internet and take delivery from the physical store, or the customer can browse at the physical store and finally buy from the internet store. In some cases, this store and at the background the service, they can be all part of the same organization XYZ, or they can actually be even in a collaborative, competitive type of relationship, a dual relationship, and the customer getting all the preferences. So in conclusion, what I would like to say is that increasingly we see emergence of different kinds of networks due to emergence of different types of network riding on continuing advancements of information and communication technology. These act as service ecosystems. Each entity in the ecosystem focuses on the service providing side. Each entity focuses on its core competence. As a result, overall the ecosystem is now increasingly becoming more efficient and more effective and offering larger variety of services at a lower cost per service. And as a result, we are also seeing different kinds of relationships and a diffusion among the traditional roles of customers and service providers, competitors and collaborators, and this duality of emerging relationships and this duality of customers sometimes as partners and partners sometimes as customers create new paradigms for services management, which perhaps in another course on more advanced topics we will be able to discuss better. However, I will take up some key issues of these emerging situation in the next lecture. Thank you.